Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization for your daily video update for December 15th, 2023. It's Friday, so I'm going to concentrate on your questions, as many of your questions relate directly to the important issues breaking in the world. Let's start with the trip of the Biden National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to the Middle East, where he met with Netanyahu and his war cabinet. Today he's meeting with President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. He was supposedly sent there by Biden to send a message, which is that Israel should wrap up the operation in Gaza because it's turning the world against Israel, and Biden didn't say it, but also against the United States, which is providing a flank to protect Israel. Now, Netanyahu may have heard what Sullivan said, but he insisted, "We will finish the job, which is to annihilate Hamas." And the defense minister said that may take 2 to 3 more months. Now, with the possibility of new elections looming in Israel, Netanyahu's only chance to stay in power is to continue the war. So the question that came in on this was, is there any opposition in Israel to the killing of civilians in Gaza and the West Bank? Now, the problem is that just as though most people in the West believe that the war in Ukraine began in February 2022, that is, they have no idea of the actual backstory of Putin's efforts to avoid the special military operation by negotiations, and so therefore they think Putin's attack was unprovoked. People in Israel and around the world are focused on the retribution for the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel and have very little understanding of the longer history of the battle between Israel and the Palestinians, which was set up largely by the British in the beginning of the 20th century. And I've covered that a lot in previous discussions, so let me just move ahead to the relevant question here. If you're focused on that, then even if you're a part of the peace movement in Israel, you've been forced, in a sense, to respond to the present situation by saying, well, we want peace with the Palestinians, but something must be done about Hamas. If you're one of the hardcore Greater Israel fanatics, this is the ideal opportunity to take that sentiment and use it to drive the Palestinians out of Palestine completely. So people in the peace movement, when they speak in anguished tones, saying things about the limits of military power and so on. But they've been largely intimidated from commenting on what Netanyahu's doing. So when they hear about the reaction to the global majority to the war, it tends to be dismissed in Israel as, well, that's typical anti-Semitic rhetoric. We're the victims, we're always blamed. So there's a notable exception to this, and that's some courageous journalists. And let me just read to you a little bit from the December 14th editorial in Haaretz. By the way, the Israeli government is trying to crack down on Haaretz because there are some articles there which identify what the problem is, like this editorial. It says that it's the extremism in the Netanyahu government which is the problem, referring specifically to Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security advisor for Netanyahu, and the rejection of his crowd of a two-state solution. The editorial says, quote, "Netanyahu's government is anything but conservative. It's a revolutionary, rightist, radical, messianic government that advanced a regime change coup and is dreaming of annexing the territories," unquote. They continue to say this is actually Netanyahu's policy, referring to his role in building up Hamas to avoid the unity of Palestinians in a fight for a two-state solution. The editorial says Netanyahu is not acting for Israel's good, but for his political survival. The problem isn't Ben-Gvir. The problem is Netanyahu. A second question from Charles. What's going on in Argentina? Is it IMF-directed shock therapy? Did they break with the BRICS? What's going on? Well, with the electoral victory earlier this month of Javier Milei, The victory is largely due to the profound economic crisis in Argentina. Inflation, no reserves, cutback of industry, debt payments coming due with no way to pay it. And so he ran on a campaign of radical free market measures. So while much of the world is de-dollarizing, he wants to make the dollar the official currency of Argentina, shut down the central bank, cut the budget. He campaigned with a chainsaw to make the point that he will chainsaw government agencies and so on. And he also said that Argentina would not align with the BRICS, even though Argentina was accepted into the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa coalition, at the BRICS meeting in August. Now, what's happened? Reality is hit. Argentina is pretty much on its own, and the free market policy will not work the way Milei anticipated. So what's happening is a change on this question of China. The problem is that Argentina owes $1 billion to the International Monetary Fund that has to be paid by December 21st, and they have no foreign reserves to pay it. So it turns out that Milei and his foreign minister met with a representative of Xi Jinping, who is attending Milei's inauguration in Argentina. And they asked China to reactivate a $20 billion yuan swap line to provide liquidity so Argentina can pay the IMF loan. The Chinese representative Wu Weihua, who's the vice president of the People's National Congress, met with Milei for a relatively long meeting. Milei gave him a personal letter to Xi Jinping, saying that he would like to speak with Xi by phone. The Chinese invited Milei to China, and it appears as though that's going to take place. So what's going on is that the U.S. and the other countries that cheered on the Milei victory have nothing to offer Argentina but full austerity policies of the IMF, which means they're going to have to gouge more than a billion to come up with any money to pay off the debt later this week. So they say to China, please help us, and the Chinese appear willing to do so. So we'll see. This is a work in progress. These kinds of radical free market policies usually don't work because the solution is not to cut the budget, it's to figure out how to produce more. And that's why the previous government, was willing to work with the Belt and Road Initiative for a whole series of projects, which would have infused capital into Argentina for a real economic recovery. If all you're going to do is sell off state industries to make money from that way, there's a limit to it, as the Russians found out. Once you sell them off, what are you left with? Nothing. And so I think we're going to see some very interesting times ahead for Argentina, and this is part of the fight going on internationally of the emergence of a new development order versus the old IMF colonial system. Now, the third question is from Ian in West Yorkshire, United Kingdom. And he's asking, what's happening in Sudan, where you have a civil war underway between the Rapid Deployment Force and the regular army? Well, it's a useful question because it actually mirrors what's happening in Israel right now. You have racial and ethnic tensions between the north and south in Sudan. You have conflict over access to water, over land. But most importantly, look at the map and remember, Sudan was part of the British Empire through the Egypt-Sudan condominium. Sudan borders Egypt, Libya, the Red Sea, it's in the Horn of Africa. The Blue Nile and the White Nile flow through it, and they meet in Khartoum, where they form the Nile River and flow northward into Egypt. This is a strategic location, just as we're seeing with Gaza, where you have the confluence of governments moving into the BRICS. You have Egypt, you have Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia. These are all countries that are affected by the ongoing civil war in Sudan. Now, why is there a civil war? Well, between 1899 and 1956, the United Kingdom ruled Sudan, and they divided it into two separate territories, the Muslim Arabic-speaking north and the African south. The person who pulled this together was the famous British Imperial General Lord Kitchener, who set up an Anglo-Egyptian rule. And this continued until 1956, when it was broken by Nasser. Nasser essentially said the Egypt-Sudan condominium didn't work, and Sudan was given its alleged freedom from the British Empire. But once again, we see the old strategy of divide and rule, and it has to do with territory. What would be the way to break out of this crisis? It would be joining the BRICS. It would be economic development. The LaRouche movement has repeatedly, following a trip by Lyndon LaRouche to Sudan, we've put forward programs, including the idea of a TVA-style project, using the rivers of Sudan as the basis of making Sudan the breadbasket of Africa because of the fertile land and the availability of water. So I'll be linking a report from the Executive Intelligence Review in the description section. But the secret here is you have to overcome the way the British set these things up. Just as they set up the confrontation over the two-state solution in Israel, based on the Peel Commission in 1937, the decision to set up this Egypt-Sudan condominium was designed to make Sudan always dependent as a subordinate colony of the British Empire, as opposed to being a sovereign nation state. And so what we're seeing fought out today in Sudan, while there are many local and familial, tribal, religious differences that underlie the crisis, the real issue there is how do sovereign nations develop? Same thing we were just talking about with Argentina. Either you have a move to a new global development order, not a central bank dictatorship, not a private bank cartel control of trade and finance, but a potential to invest in the future of these economies with the investments going largely into scientific and technological development, infrastructure development, and manufacturing. And that's the only way you can escape what otherwise are time bombs set to blow up all over the world and set up by the British Empire and also the French and the other empires, the Belgian, the Portuguese, and others, to ensure that countries that are rich in raw materials and people are left to rot and go into a state of depopulation, civil wars, starvation, and so on, as opposed to emerging as a sovereign nation as part of a global network of sovereign nations that work for mutual benefit. Now, the final question was sent in from someone in Poland who said, what do you make of Putin's national press conference? The fact that he's receiving up to 1 million questions. The media portrays this as an election gimmick. What can you say about what Putin does with this? Well, it's simple. Putin's talking to the Russian people. The media in the West portrays it as an election gimmick because their view of Putin is so thoroughly false and one-dimensional that they won't even let you hear what he says without injecting comments from so-called Russian experts who demean whatever he's saying. Every year except last year, he's held this kind of press conference. Now, what he discussed yesterday was a full discussion of the progress on the special military operation in Ukraine, what the potential is, how Russia's economy is developing, his commitment to advancing industry and agriculture in Russia, and also a lot of discussion of international relations in which he said, look, the problem in Europe is the European countries have given up their sovereignty and follow the U.S. policy. And he said, we would still like to have good relations with the United States, but not as a subordinate to a U.S. unipolar order. Now, try to find really large sections of quotes from him or a transcript. Try to find that through Google or the Western media. It's not there. They don't want you to hear what he has to say. They want to tell you what to think about him. And this comes up all the time. I had a discussion yesterday with someone who said, how do I say to my friends that their view of Putin is wrong? Well, ask them, what do you know about what he's saying? And why do you assume that Putin is a paranoid defender of an empire, when if you look at the history of the post-Soviet Union, what you'll find is the West has repeatedly lied to the Russian leaders. They lied about the expansion of NATO eastward to the Russian border. They lied about their attempt to form or sign a treaty to end the fighting against the people of eastern Ukraine, the so-called Minsk Accord. Merkel and Hollande, the Chancellor of Germany and President of France, as well as Poroshenko, the President of Ukraine, admitted they had no intention of following through on the agreement. The Maidan coup, one step after another. So is Putin paranoid when he says you can't trust the West? We have documentation of 30 years of Western lying to Russia. And Putin saying, look, let's resolve this. Let's have mutual security guarantees. So, I would say to people, before you judge Putin, recognize that in addition to the lying directly related to Russia, look what happened in Libya. That they lied to the Russians at the UN Security Council to keep Russia from vetoing an operation. They lied about Iraq. They lied about Afghanistan. And by they, I mean the West, the US and NATO. So it's not that Putin is paranoid, it's that he's realistic. And he's looking at a world in which the West has a commitment to dismantle Russia and loot its raw materials. And how does he know that? Number one, look what happened during the 1990s when Russia was weak and the West said, we're going to help you. And instead they helped themselves to setting up oligarchs to steal the raw materials of Russia, which was only stopped when Putin came in 1999. Secondly, read the National Defense Authorization Act documents. Read the RAND Corporation reports that say that Russia is an adversary. Russia's raw material wealth could be available to the West except for Putin. So the idea of a global colony, a colonial policy in which Russia is treated as a poor third world country, that's rejected by Putin. Now here's the kicker to that. It's rejected by the entire global South. The global majority is rising up against the unipolar order. And Putin is seen as one of the articulate spokesmen for that uprising. It's not because Putin wants to take control of the world, it's that he's standing up as a Russian nationalist to defend his nation and his people. I wish we had a leader like that in the United States and in Germany. So thanks for your questions, thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again next week.